Hi, I'm Amy Robertson with Hearts and Homes for Refugees. We are a small nonprofit in Westchester County, New York, that helps to welcome refugees through the community sponsorship process. And we're here to talk today about sponsorship of Ukrainians in particular. And I'm joined by Ann Smith.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ann Smith with the Ukraine Immigration Task Force. Our organization helps Ukrainians who are seeking refuge in the United States to come over here and go through some of the immigration processes and get set up with organizations like Hearts and Homes.
Thanks. So I'll start off. I'm going to kick it off by sharing my screen and talking a little bit about what is community sponsorship. What does it mean to be a sponsor? Can you confirm for me, Anne, that you can see my screen okay?
Yep, everything is clear.
Okay, great. Hearts and Homes for Refugees is a volunteer-driven nonprofit organization, and we were founded on the belief that welcoming communities and the grassroots community can be really the way to welcoming more refugees in the United States. And we do this through a holistic and responsible process where we really want to make sure the needs of the new arrivals are met. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Community sponsors are responsible take on a responsibility of meeting these needs that cross these various areas. So this includes housing is the first thing, and it's a pretty formidable challenge in the New York area, and finding an appropriate place for a new arrival to stay. Sometimes sponsors host in their own home. And, as you can imagine, that can, get tricky pretty fast. So finding housing that eventually the new arrival can move into is really important. And getting a person oriented to the local community, helping them to find that first job, helping them to learn English if that's needed, getting children enrolled in school, getting families enrolled in healthcare, in benefits if they're entitled to them, getting them the phone service and Wi-Fi so that they can connect to the school, the job, everything that they need to connect to, and helping families or individuals to plan a budget. When you arrive in the United States, some of the costs may be a real surprise. Somebody might not have had that kind of experience of needing to budget so carefully, but for many new arrivals, money's tight, and it's really important to have a good understanding of what the expenses need to be covered and how to budget for them. If you have a team of volunteers, this can really help to meet all of these different needs, and the teams can distribute the tasks, breaking them into short and long term, and doing some of them remotely. Some of it, for example, might be driving to an appointment, driving to a job interview, helping to raise money for the expenses that are needed, doing fundraising, and then coordinating all of those volunteer needs, all of those tasks. The first steps for a new arrival is, welcoming them to their housing, whether it's in your own home or into housing that you've been able to find for the new arrival. And usually, at least traditionally in the refugee admissions program, welcoming is also with a hot meal that's culturally appropriate. And so whether or not you're participating in the refugee admissions program or under a different program like Uniting for Ukraine, that's always a great way to welcome someone. Then phase 2 starts, going through all of these different areas that we have just talked about, and making sure that step by step people are resettling in the United States. Typically, to get settled in a little bit and get oriented takes about 6 months. So, being a sponsor isn't just a short-term commitment. Making sure that people are successful, can take anywhere from 3 to 12 months. When people arrive, we want to just remember to really focus and treat people through by looking at them through a strength-based lens. And, what does that mean? Refugees who arrive are competent and intelligent and resilient. They might have arrived with very little from a material point of view, but they brought their experiences and their skills, and they've brought their hope. And we can really serve them by empowering them to become self-sufficient in all ways. Throughout the refugee resettlement process, volunteers need to first and foremost try to empower, not doing for, but showing new arrivals how to do things, teaching them, the classic proverb of teaching a man to fish. Give them the tools so they can successfully navigate their own lives in their new communities. The goal is independence and financial self-sufficiency, not dependence or gratitude. When we are working with new arrivals, we're often privy to a lot of information that is pretty private, not just their immigration status, but also information about their finances, about their health. And so we really want to be sure to respect the privacy. If you're working in a group of volunteers, there might be some general information that you're sharing across volunteers, but that doesn't mean that everybody needs to have the full information. Particularly health information, even under HIPAA, a lot of it is required to be kept confidential. But in general, we just want to respect the right to privacy for each individual and each family. We want to respect the right to their privacy also in terms of their own story. What caused them to leave their home country is really for them to choose whether or not to share. We don't want people to be hearing back from the volunteers speaking to one another, even if they do choose to share with one volunteer. It's not necessarily appropriate to share with all. We don't want families or individuals to hear back from others things that they might have shared with one. So just remembering to really respect the privacy and all the time that you're spending with supporting a refugee. We also want to encourage agency and respect choices. So when a refugee is forced from their country, then that they've had this choice taken away from them. The decision making is always their prerogative, and we want to encourage this also as a way to move along the path to recovery, help them to rebuild their lives and adapt to their new home. So as a sponsor or as a volunteer, you can make suggestions, provide information, and you might be asked for advice, and you can provide advice, including pros and cons. But even if a new arrival chooses to proceed in a way that you wouldn't have chosen, or that you might not think is in their best interest, it's important to remember that it's generally the client's right to choose how they want to proceed. The exception would be if they wanted to proceed in a way that is harmful to another, harmful to themselves, or illegal, then that's another step you could insist. But in general, most choices, even if they differ from your own, it's really their prerogative, and we want to be respectful of that. As an example, we see this a lot around parenting. Volunteers might provide information and support. You might have a way that you think is a great parenting style, but what really matters is the parents are making well-informed decisions and taking care of their children. Spending decisions is another area. If the new arrivals covering their basic needs, volunteers should respect how they're choosing their agency over their spending their money. So, another area sometimes, for example, that we've seen with refugees that we've resettled is, perhaps there's a parent who buys a gift that's more lavish than we would expect for somebody that maybe doesn't have a very high income yet. But in some countries, that's a cultural norm, or in some people, it's just a personal preference. As long as they're meeting their basic needs, that's fine. We also want to be mindful when we are working with new arrivals that we are providing what we call trauma-informed care. This is a really important issue to understand because while not all refugees have experienced violent trauma, everyone that arrives here has experienced the trauma of forced displacement, of being uprooted from their home and from their culture. We know that that refugees have made it here, and we might not know why, but we want to respect, again, their right to have agency over their own story. Their stories for them to keep or to share according to what they are comfortable with. It's not for us to ask or know unless they choose to tell us. And that's why when we're speaking with new arrivals to this country, we focus on the here and now. What do you think since arrival? What are your plans for the future? Asking questions about the past. Did you leave family behind? what forced you to leave. These can be very triggering, and it's not our right to know, even if it's a person that we are supporting. Trauma can present itself in many ways with new arrivals. It might be physical or emotional. It can, for example, impact someone's memory, make them have mood swings or be irritable, feel depressed or hopeless and withdrawn, or confusion and difficulty concentrating. And this is often compounded by the fact that there's a lot of new information when somebody arrives to a new country. And so having patience with new arrivals is a really key as a sponsor or volunteer, being sensitive to the verbal and emotional cues that people are exhibiting, and having the patience to repeat new information and continue to offer support and guidance. And not overwhelmed with too much information at one time. If you see trauma really manifesting in the way a person is acting or reacting, there are things that you can do to help. Sometimes it's simply giving space. That might feel like doing nothing, but sometimes it's what a person most needs. Gently asking if there's something that you might be able to do to help. And then if you're really concerned about somebody's well-being, then making sure that the person is aware of the mental health resources that are available in the United States is a great way to support them. Another important support that volunteers and sponsors can offer is helping new arrivals to manage expectations. Thinking about what's your short-term goal versus your long-term goal. Especially many new arrivals might come with a professional background that is quite robust and arrive in the United States. They don't have US work experience. They might not have the language skills, and the job that they get might be a real step down. And focusing on this is for now, this is your first step, and you can and it's not your last step. Your first job won't be your last. Getting employed is important, and every job is dignified. You might do that, for example, by sharing about a job that you had in your past. My first job was at Burger King. Where was your first job? Support the perspective that every job is dignified. We also often hear that people would like to become an Uber driver. That's not necessarily sustainable or feasible. In New York, at least, Uber drivers have to have had their license for 1 year, and you don't get health care benefits. So thinking about, what can be a great job for right now, that might not be it, but they can take that short-term step of at least, studying for the permit test and getting a license and leave that as a longer-term goal. This applies also for English learning, which can get really discouraging at times. It really takes a long time to learn another language. And so people might feel that they're not progressing, and really helping new arrivals to understand, what's a realistic expectation about progressing in English, encouraging people to stick with it. For those of us who have learned another language, we know that sometimes it feels like you're not getting anywhere, and then suddenly you have a breakthrough. So trying to be encouraging about expectations and helping to manage those. At the same time, power dynamics often come into play between sponsors and the new arrivals. As the sponsor or the volunteer, you're holding the power. You might be the one that's providing housing. You might be the one who's provided household furnishings, or is really the one helping to find the job. You're the one that knows US culture because you're already here. And so we want to really be sensitive to this and provide the space for the new arrival to maintain their own power. Avoid putting a new arrival in a situation where they have to do something to please you or to do something outside of their comfort zone. So that, for example, we want to be sensitive about invitations to social events. While it's wonderful to provide community connections and to invite new arrivals to share, they might want some time on their own and not feel as comfortable joining in a social event. So being respectful of that. Remembering that in other cultures, often respect for elders is is a bigger factor than in the United States. So older sponsors or older volunteers, by making a suggestion, the new arrival might take it as an instruction or a mandate. So really always presenting information and choices as options. We want to have also mutual respect for cultural norms. So for a Ukrainian American hosting a Ukrainian, there might even be a difference depending on when the person arrived, compared to how the Ukrainian American, has been brought up in their own house, or what they might remember if they came from Ukraine when they were young. And certainly for those who are not Ukrainian, understanding that there might be different ways of interacting. I had one Ukrainian talk to me about just how direct Ukrainians can be, and that sometimes came as perhaps a little bit of a surprise to some volunteers. Having an understanding of cultural norms helps us to treat each other with understanding and respect. We also sometimes see with volunteers or sponsors some over assisting or over giving. So generosity is beautiful and amazing, and that's why people become sponsors and volunteers with generous hearts. But this goes back to providing the tools and ensuring independence. So not over assisting by doing things for, and not over giving when people need to have the motivation to become self-sufficient and independent for themselves. We don't want to be enabling people to be dependent at the same time that we are supporting. So, the first 3 months post-arrival, there is normally a very intense need for support. But then at that point, you should normally see people able to do more and more things for themselves. If you're working in a small group, this is another way that makes it a little bit easier to manage those expectations or the needs of a new arrival, because it gives you an out. If they make a request for something that you can't do, you can say, I need to take it back to the group, and then decide together whether this is something that the group can help with or not. For anyone who is welcoming an arrival through the refugee admissions program, it's also really important to not be handing out cash to new arrivals, that it can be recorded as income and become a conflict with the benefits they might be receiving. So, if they need a little support, need to buy some new clothes or some groceries, we often provide gift cards instead. So we do try to limit, personal purchases, not so many just lavish gifts. That can also go back to the question of the power dynamic. If you're constantly providing for somebody, then they can become very indebted. So, a birthday gift is always a wonderful thing, but trying to maintain also a dynamic that it has a balance of power, and is very important. So these were the points that I wanted to talk about, kind of the emotional side and the practical side of community sponsorship. And I'm going to turn it over now to Anne to talk about some of the legal responsibilities of sponsorship.
Thank you so much, Amy. I really appreciate the informative presentation. So I'm going to figure out once again how to share my screen, or perhaps not sure why this is more difficult now than it used to be. Let's see. Oh, duh, sorry. Okay. There we go. Sorry about that once again. So as Amy mentioned, we're going to talk about some of the more legal and procedural aspects of sponsorship. So we're going to discuss briefly the sponsor and beneficiary eligibility, the different types of community sponsorship, the applications and documents required. We're going to talk briefly about the sponsor's responsibilities, and we're going to go over just some of the rights and benefits currently available. So both sponsors and beneficiaries are required to meet certain eligibility criteria in order to be considered under the Uniting for Ukraine program. And I'm not sure, what the level of knowledge here is, but Uniting for Ukraine is the primary program available to sponsor individuals from Ukraine for a short term period through humanitarian parole. So, in order to be eligible as a sponsor, the individual must be either a U.S. citizen or U.S. national, or hold a valid immigrant or non-immigrant status. So that can include a lawful permanent resident, temporary resident, a person with an unexpired visa, a person who is granted asylum or themselves admitted through a refugee program. It can also be a person who currently holds temporary protected status, but the person must have already been granted that status. And it can also be a person who is granted asylum. And again, the person has to have been granted, not simply somebody who applied for it. Oops, sorry. So the beneficiary requirements are a little bit more limited. The Ukrainian must have resided in Ukraine immediately before the Russian invasion through February 11th, 2022, and was displaced as a result of the invasion. They may be either living in Ukraine currently or left Ukraine temporarily, but they are not able to be considered for this program if they are already residing in the United States. And then the second criteria is they must be a Ukrainian citizen and have a Ukrainian passport, or they must be a child in a parent's Ukrainian passport. The only exceptions to citizenship are for immediate family members, and for purposes of this program, those are limited to a spouse or common law partner of a Ukrainian citizen or an unmarried child under the age of 21 who is traveling with a parent or guardian. So we're going to move on to the types of community sponsorship. And there are two primary ways to go about this. An individual can either co-sponsor jointly with other individuals, and that can include friends, family members, work colleagues, members of their congregation, or other types of networks, even, for example, a Rotary Club or other civic organization. Or we can have sponsorship through an organization that is acting on its own behalf, such as a religious congregation, a community organization, another type of nonprofit. So with joint sponsorship, which is a group of individuals who are co-sponsoring, one person will need to be designated as the lead sponsor to fill out the sponsor application, which is called Form I-134A. And the sponsor group will need to show that collectively they have sufficient resources to sponsor each of the beneficiaries that they wish to sponsor. In order to submit an application as joint individual sponsors, the lead sponsor will need to include a statement about the intent of this other sponsors to share responsibility to support the beneficiary. And the supplemental documentation that the lead sponsor provides will need to mention the identities and describe the resources of the other sponsors. And as always, an application will need to be filed for each beneficiary that they wish to sponsor. Now, an organizational sponsor is when the organization itself is looking to be the sponsor using its own resources and its own group organization. So as with joint co-sponsorship, the person from an organization will need to be designated as the lead sponsor to fill out the application. This could be either an employee of the organization, the group's leader, or another representative. We've had administrative employees, we've had, pastors, we've had, for example, a parish, or synagogue council president. So those would all be examples of lead sponsors. And as with the other type of community sponsorship, an organization will need to mention not only their intent to support the beneficiary, but also how they're going to help the lead sponsor support the beneficiary. And this will require some supplemental information to be submitted. So with an organizational sponsor, the lead sponsor will need to provide some of this information both on the form that they fill out online and also in a separate supplemental letter that they submit about the organization or organizations that are going to be helping them sponsor. So in this situation, the lead sponsor must still submit some information about themselves, their name, their biographical information, but they don't need to include all of the information about their own income or assets. But they will need to include a supplemental letter from the organization that details the organization's intent to support both the sponsor and the beneficiary. And those support areas will include financial needs, initial and more permanent housing, assistance with work permits and ID applications, employment, education, and other types of enrollment for benefits. So the sponsorship process itself is initiated by a U.S. sponsor, and the formal name of a sponsor is a supporter. So the supporter will fill out Form I-134A, the Declaration of Financial Support, fully online. And so this entire process of sponsorship under Uniting for Ukraine is actually automated from start to finish. So the U.S. sponsor will create a USCIS account, or if they already have a USCIS account, they can just log into their existing account and fill out the application. So the goal of this first stage is to submit the required information on the form itself, which they'll go through and submit, sort of window by window and fill in the data. So they will want to provide all of the information that's actually asked in a form, as well as the documentation that will show the U.S. government who these prospective sponsors are and whether they can support the Ukrainian beneficiary during their temporary stay in the United States. So some of the data and the forms will need to be collected before the sponsor actually fills out the application. So the sponsor will be asked to provide some biographical and financial information about themselves, as well as about the beneficiary or beneficiaries that they wish to sponsor. The sponsor will need to submit proof of their citizenship or lawful immigration status in the United States. They will need to submit documents that show their income and assets, and they will need to complete all of the questions in the application itself. So some of the information that is needed from the sponsor will include their household size, dependents, such as children, parents that are in their sponsor's household, all of the income from various sources. Now, the requirement for a sponsor's income is to meet 100% of the U.S. poverty guidelines for each beneficiary sponsored. So the U.S. poverty guidelines are updated from year to year, and they can be found on the US government website. So, as an example, let's say we have a couple, and the couple has, two children as dependents. So they would want to look up for a household size of 4, what are the US poverty guidelines for that household size? And then let's say they want to sponsor, 2 Ukrainian beneficiaries, for example, a mother and her child. So they would just need to multiply that income by 2 and make sure that they are able to show that sufficient revenue. So not every single source of income necessarily has to be submitted if the sponsor can fairly easily show enough income from a few primary sources, especially in this case, since we're talking about community sponsorship. The main concern is to show that the revenue itself, is relatively stable, and, that the person expects to keep receiving these revenue sources, and also that the number in, the income statement is sufficient. So the types of revenue, certainly W-2 forms. We have a lot of people who are self-employed, and they ask, what about our income? How can we show that? So, people who have small businesses or self-employed individuals, they might be able to show, either 1099, or they might be able to show, accounts receivable, or, some of the other types of income statements that are more designed, for independent contractors or small businesses. So the assets are also a key item that the US government is looking for, but the assets that are really the most important are those that can be converted into cash within 12 months if the person must, get extra income to support the beneficiary. So really, money in bank accounts, stocks, bonds, other investments, those are probably the primary assets that USCIS is looking at. But, if a person has an equity in a second home or other real property, or maybe has a second or third vehicle that they can easily sell, that's something that can be, uploaded. And in the, group sponsorship situations where an organization, maybe has a set income or certain assets, they don't need to go into all of the levels of detail of their income if they're easily able to show that they have, sufficient, consistent income. So the letter just needs to come from, the lead sponsor, but it needs to show the commitments and amounts from each of the co-sponsors or from the organization itself. So the sponsor will want to provide proof of their U.S. citizenship or lawful permanent residence or non-immigrant status, which can be a copy of an unexpired visa, their I-94 arrival departure record. They will want to submit a statement from an employer describing, their type and date of employment, their salary. They generally will want to submit a letter from a bank or financial institution that describes the assets held there, how much, that sort of the history of deposits in the past year. I will say that we have had sponsors submit, just more general information. When they can show enough income, sometimes they just submit some of their, account balances or other statements that show their investments. So that's something, one of the items that's listed by USCIS. But the tax returns are usually the most useful way to show income. So the most recent tax returns would be ideal. So if a person doesn't have tax returns or hasn't filed them yet for the year, then some of the other items we described earlier, like the W-2 forms, 1099s, other, income statements, pay stubs, that type of documentation can be helpful. And then if asset is listed, then USCIS will need to see the proof of ownership for that asset. There is a little bit of information that the sponsor will need to collect from the beneficiary. They will need to collect their identification, their contact information. They want to make sure that the beneficiary's passport information is accurate, because we've had situations where the passport number was inputted incorrectly in the sponsor's application, and it's a little bit more challenging to fix it after the sponsor's application has been approved, and even more difficult to fix it once the beneficiary's travel authorizations have been issued. They will want to also make sure that an email address is accurate, because the beneficiary will be receiving some communications in the later stages from USCIS and also from Customs and Border Protection. So, the citizenship information, passport information, and then any income that the beneficiary is planning to contribute to their own sponsorship. And it's completely fine if the beneficiary doesn't have any income or assets to contribute, but some do. And so the goal with all of this information is to show as much of the picture as possible to help basically support the application, and to show the US government that this beneficiary or beneficiaries will be able to make it here for the duration of the parole term. So in July of 2023, there was a new question added to the sponsorship application that asked why this particular beneficiary should be granted humanitarian parole as a matter of policy. So just as a very quick background, so Uniting for Ukraine works by assessing a sponsor's ability to support a Ukrainian beneficiary for up to 2 years, which is the longest period that Ukrainian may be granted humanitarian parole for the initial parole period. And so humanitarian parole itself is a temporary entry. It's not really considered its own immigration status per se. The purpose of humanitarian parole traditionally was to allow individuals to enter the United States when they didn't have a visa and when they weren't able to go through the process of applying to come through another route, or they had an emergency situation and had to come here. And so humanitarian parole is the mechanism that's used now for some of these sponsorship programs. But the policy of humanitarian parole is to assess each individual that's trying to come to the United States to determine if they should be granted that emergency entry for their temporary stay. And so sponsors will need to get a little bit of information about the beneficiary if they can. Some of that information can be more general, like country conditions, some regional issues that are taking place, for example, in Eastern Ukraine, in Kyiv. Or there could be some more personal characteristics, such as a medical condition, or the family, might be under a particular threat because of their own personal characteristics. Or, they just maybe aren't able to find shelter, or their, homes are destroyed, or they can't find clean water and food or something like that. And so the sponsor will just need to write a short statement describing why each of the beneficiaries that they wish to sponsor should be granted humanitarian parole. So we're going to move on a little bit to the sponsor's responsibilities. There are 3 questions on Form I-134A that specifically ask how the sponsor plans to support the beneficiary during their initial parole term, and that is up to 2 years. We get a lot of questions about how long a sponsor must support the beneficiary. The language of the form does describe the term as being up to 2 years. In practice, the level of support may be adjusted, with time. So as Amy mentioned, when the beneficiaries first arrive, that's the most critical time when maybe they won't have any language skills, or they might be looking for housing, they might be looking for a job. And so in those first 90 to 180 days, really the sponsor support is the most critical. And of course, in a community sponsorship situation, there is a little bit more of a safety network, and, people are able to help them with different aspects and help them, with both the requirements and with settling in. But, sponsors are technically on the hook to provide, some of this support and be that safety net for the full 2 years. Now, if that beneficiary, applies to stay here longer, or, qualifies for another program, for another term of parole, the sponsor's not required to do, any financial sponsorship beyond those 2 years. But generally speaking, they should expect to, be available, for the full 2 years. Another thing I wanted to mention is that for this program, sponsors are not required to host the beneficiaries in their own homes, but housing is, of course, very challenging to find in any, city in the United States. And so staying in a sponsor's home could just be a temporary option. So what are some of the sponsor's requirements? I'm going to quote directly from Form I-134A. Number 1, receive, maintain, and support the beneficiary for the duration of their temporary stay in the United States. Number 2, ensure the beneficiary has safe and appropriate housing for the duration of their parole. And number 3, assist the beneficiary's access to available services and benefits, such as learning English, securing employment opportunities once authorized to work, enrolling children in school, and helping to enroll for benefits for which they are eligible. So the 3 questions on the sponsor application will require the sponsor to describe the resources that they plan to use or provide to ensure that the beneficiary has adequate financial support, that their housing needs are met, how they will help with some of the services and benefits. And again, in this situation of community sponsorship, some of this information will already be included in the supplemental letter. And so, this particular question applies to all sponsors, whether they're individual or community sponsors. But, sponsors should not get too anxious about, going into every level of detail, and submitting, the chart of who's going to, handle each appointment and each transportation, each piece of furniture, but just, to basically show USCIS that they have thought this through, that they have a plan, and that they understand their responsibilities. So, as Amy mentioned, there are different roles that organizational sponsors and joint sponsors can take on. And so, of course, housing, food, benefits, applications, helping kids, helping with education, transportation. So these are some of the items that USCIS will ask. But, again, this is information that I think all sponsors to some extent, will need to think through. So this very loose timeline shows sort of the different stages of the sponsorship process. So the first stage is, of course, that the sponsor submits their Form I-134A and all of the supporting documentation for each beneficiary in a separate application. The next step is USCIS will review the supporter's application and issue an individual decision for each application for each beneficiary. People ask us very frequently, how long does this step take? So generally speaking, the obviously the process of submitting the information depends on the sponsor or sponsor circles and all the information they submit. The actual review process, once the application is submitted, it can take anywhere, from 4 to 8 weeks. We've had really quick reviews, and then we've had some, that take 3 months. USCIS indicates that it can take up to 6 months, but generally speaking, we tend to see that 4 to 8 week window. Now, I will say that USCIS is, extremely busy. They have not only this Uniting for Ukraine parole program, but other parole programs for people from other countries. And so, they do have limited staff. And then, of course, they're subject to some of the other, holiday scheduling. And, they are obviously involved in all of the other immigration processes. And so if a person, submits a sponsor application, doesn't hear back, it doesn't necessarily mean that their application is denied. It could just be that the application takes a while. And, the other thing I'll mention is that sometimes different applications will receive a decision at different times. So just keep that in mind. So hopefully, if the applications are approved, then the third step is USCIS will then notify the sponsor and will send a notification to the beneficiaries at the emails that were provided for the beneficiaries. And those will have instructions on how to set up their USCIS accounts. So then the beneficiary will need to complete their biographical information. They will need to upload some of their information about health attestations, minor, attestations. Any minors, under 18 years old will need to be added to the primary beneficiaries travel group, and, all of their information submitted. And then once that is submitted, it goes to the Department of Homeland Security, and Customs and Border Protection will then conduct some vetting of the beneficiaries just to take a look at their previous immigration into the United States, any history, any incidents, also security screening, and, just to confirm that their information is correct. And so once that process has been completed, if they are approved to travel, then Customs and Border Protection will then email the beneficiaries directly with travel authorizations, and those will be the documents needed in order to make travel arrangements. People do not need to apply for separate visas to travel. This is how they will be able to arrive. And then the final step is that Customs and Border Protection will then interview each beneficiary who is coming into the United States. So really quickly, we're just going to touch on some of the rights and benefits for Ukrainian beneficiaries. So as I mentioned, they will be granted humanitarian parole for up to 2 years. Now, it's important to understand that having humanitarian parole is not the same thing as being a refugee with a capital R under the US legal definition. Humanitarian parole does not provide a direct pathway to US citizenship. It's just nothing more than the right to enter the United States lawfully without a visa. It doesn't mean that beneficiaries can't apply for citizenship if they have other avenues available to them. But it's important to note the distinction between a parolee and a refugee with a capital R. So while their parole remains valid, Uniting for Ukraine humanitarian parolees are allowed to work, and they may apply to travel outside of the United States. Now, Ukrainians who come through the Uniting for Ukraine program, they are automatically eligible to work as soon as they enter the United States for the first 90 days of their hire. They will not need to show a work permit. This is written into the USCIS regulations. They can show as proof of their employment authorization, their I-94, any information that shows that they are here lawfully under Uniting for Ukraine. However, if they intend to work longer than 90 days, they will need to show a work permit, and that is called an employment authorization document, or EAD. And the way that they can apply for that work permit is to fill out Form I-765, which they can do online from their USCIS accounts as soon as they arrive here. And for Ukrainian parolees, that is a fee-exempt application. So once they arrive, they're able to fill this out, and they should receive that work permit, which will be good for the duration of their parole term. Now, they are also allowed to apply for a travel document if they need to leave the United States temporarily. And this can either be done online or by mail. I will just note briefly that if they foresee any travel abroad from the United States during their parole, it's best to apply for an advanced travel document as soon as possible, because it can take several months to obtain one of those documents. So right now, moving on to some of the other benefits for parolees. As of today, Ukrainian parolees are not eligible for some of the health benefits and services that the initial parolees under this program were eligible for. So those Ukrainians who were paroled into the United States by September 30th, 2023, were eligible for some of the benefits such as Social Security income, Medicaid, TANF, CHIP, SNAP, refugee cash assistance. Again, they had to apply and meet the qualifications, but some of these resettlement services were authorized by Congress. Right now, we have not yet heard of any reauthorization by Congress to extend these benefits to parolees who started to arrive as of October 1st of this year. So as of right now, those parolees are not eligible for the federal mainstream benefits or some of the initial resettlement benefits funded through the Office of Refugee Resettlement, with very narrow exceptions of certain family members of Ukrainians who were paroled by September 30th. So this is something that is subject to change as we're sort of watching, the minute by minute congressional actions on this. And it's possible that those benefits could be reauthorized. But for the time being, sponsors might want to reach out to their state refugee coordinators or their local resettlement organizations to find out either which state level benefits could be available. And there are some states, that have some transitional benefits, or, other assistance through nonprofits or private entities. So that wraps up our portion. And I'm going to, there we go, stop sharing my screen.
Okay, thank you so much for that very thorough explanation of the legal responsibilities, and also could really appreciate all you were saying about the joint sponsorship. I know it's not always possible. Sometimes people don't have other individuals that they can call on to form a joint sponsorship or a small group, but certainly that helps to ease the burden. And I did want to mention, of course, that the Ukraine Immigration Task Force and Hearts and Homes for Refugees are part of the Ukrainian Sponsorship Support Hub for New York and New Jersey, together with IARC, the Marks JCH Bensonhurst, and New Jersey Realtors Uniting for Ukrainian Refugees. So we are always also happy to answer further questions about any of the ways to support Ukrainians that are in our area. And at the end of this, there'll be a slide that has our contact information that people can reach out. So thank you so much for this today. And we hope that people continue to support Ukrainians and other refugees.
Absolutely. And thank you very much for hosting this. It's very informative.